Hi, Cynthia Allen, back for the Feldenkrais Awareness Summit. We're on day nine, and we're starting off this morning. Well, actually, you probably started off the morning, I hope, with Arafili Nikolakopoulou's lesson in Awareness Through Movement. But now we're going to be going on with our track on research with our second talk. And first, I just want to remind you to look around. I know by this point you're probably sick of hearing Lavinia and I talk about this, but do find the chat area. It's always a little different on each device. And go over, introduce yourself. Arlene Klein will be over there, probably already said hi to you and can give you some assistance in the background. She'll also pop a few links in there. And as we've said before, we use your chat during this talk to fold into our panel discussion. So actually, I will get a chance to see your chat right after this, and I put all three chats together and pull out some of the pertinent things for the panel discussion. So if you have something interesting or we're wondering about, we might be able to address it during the panel discussion later. And so let's see here. I think I'm ready to introduce to you today's guest, Cliff Smyth. And Cliff is a Feldenkrais method teacher and practitioner. He's loves to do body, mind, health, wellness coaching. He is the editor, or I think you're still the editor of the Feldenkrais Research Journal that comes out from the International Feldenkrais Federation. His master thesis addressed the contribution of the Feldenkrais method to mind-body medicine, and his PhD research was on the lived experience of the Feldenkrais method for people with pain. He's a teaching fellow at Saybrook University and the College of Integrative Medicine and Health Sciences, and a visiting lecturer at San Francisco State University, where he teaches somatics. And he started out in the Feldenkrais method, first in Melbourne, Australia, where he was born and raised. And then the last 20 years has been in San Francisco at the Feldenkrais Center for Movement, Feldenkrais Center for Movement and Awareness, where he works with people with all kinds of things that people come to Feldenkrais practitioners for. He also served 12 years on the board as president of the IFF, the International Feldenkrais Federation, and is currently working on articles related to movement, cognition, interoception, and the role of muscular habit. So welcome, Cliff.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you. So you're kind of a guy who dabbles in a lot of things. I mean, when we were first talking about you, Lavinia says, well, why don't you have Cliff for this? And then why don't you have Cliff for that? And then why don't you have Cliff for this? And it just, wow, Cliff is into a lot of things. I mean, you're a kind of creative bent too, don't you?
A creative bent? I mean, yeah, I do like dabbling in a lot of things and exploring a lot of things. And I love my private practice. I love teaching my awareness through movement classes every week. And they really keep me honest and keep me grounded in the method. And then I love, reading phenomenology and research studies and those kinds of things. I used to be a poet when I was younger, a performance poet, and I worked in the arts. So yeah, I've been around a little bit, but I'm enjoying the science and philosophy and how Feldenkrais relates to other mind-body medicine practices too. I'm very interested in how there may be common mechanisms of action between Feldenkrais and other mind-body practices.
Great. So, I mean, I love that you have all these different backgrounds. We tapped you for trying to help us understand what does the Feldenkrais method, what does research say about the Feldenkrais method? Is there anything promising? Is there any place we can go with it? What do we have? And I think you've got a PowerPoint presentation for us.
Yeah.
And I encourage people to hang out for this presentation. I know sometimes people think, oh no, research, PowerPoint, but Cliff is going to do a great job for us. So go ahead and get us started.
I hope so. All right. So let me get this PowerPoint going. First I have to, I'm sorry, my apologies.
No worries.
Good. How's that showing, Cynthia?
Looks fabulous.
Oh, good. Okay. Oh, let's go up one slide though. So this is the topic, researching Feldenkrais method. What do we know so far? And there are all the affiliations that Cynthia mentioned. So I want to talk and give quite a bit of detail really about what research has been done so far, and especially some of the best quality research. But I also want to begin with providing a little bit of a framework of how to think about research into the Feldenkrais method, what we've done so far, and that's also relevant to other, mind, body, and somatic practices as well, I think. So one of the things, when I talk about research in the Feldenkrais community is I hear a couple of things. So one is that there's no research being done into Feldenkrais at all. And that's terrible. And the other is that somehow for ourselves, that lack of research, it's a problem because we need research to prove that Feldenkrais method works. There are a couple of the myths that I hear out there in the Feldenkrais world. So let's address myth number one. So the first one, that there's no research. So in fact, there's been quite a lot. So there's been 2 systematic reviews of Feldenkrais method done. In 2012, Pat Buchanan did a study, and she found 25 studies with level 1 or 2 research. So these are where it's a research trial, and the highest level of research is where there's some objective measures of what's being studied, and the trial is controlled. That is, there's a group of people who don't do the intervention, who don't get the Feldenkrais. Maybe they do something else, they do Pilates or something else, or maybe they do nothing or read a book. And then there's extra levels of things that guarantee quality. Can it be blinded? Can the researchers and the participants not know whether they're getting the intervention or not? And that's harder with something like Feldenkrais. And then the other thing is whether the people who've been put in the groups of the intervention group or the control group are randomized. So that also reduces the risk of bias. So Hillier and Worley did a systematic review in 2015, and they found 47 articles on the method, 20 trials, and they analyzed 7 high-quality randomized control trials. So, and since 2015, there's been several good trials and other studies published. And then there's really been a lot of writing, case studies and stuff over the years. We've got 2 Feldenkrais journals as journals, the Feldenkrais Journal from the Feldenkrais Guild of North America and the Feldenkrais Research Journal from the IFF. And then guilds in like Italy, Israel, the UK, Germany, Australia publish newsletters that also include research type articles. So there's really quite a lot of writing and thinking about the method. I think it's seen by some people as a heady profession, even though we're working with the body and movement. One of the challenges for us is that because Feldenkrais can be applied in so many ways, right, so many settings, and there's so many different kinds of outcomes for people in terms of movement or well-being, quality of life, and reduction in pain, its use in expression and creativity, that a lot of the research has been on different topics, different populations, people with different health conditions, using different measures. So there's a great heterogeneity of the studies that have been done so far. So we don't have a lot of good studies on any one topic, except perhaps in one area. So I think what can be said very clearly, and maybe this is why some people think there's no research, is that there's definitely been a challenge in terms of the quality of the research that's been done. So our studies are often small, which means they don't have a strong statistical power. But then in the whole field of mind-body medicine, complementary and alternative medicine, somatics, most studies do tend to have small numbers because we don't have the kinds of funds that that the pharmaceutical companies have, for example. as I mentioned, good quality studies are randomized and have controlled. And we had some studies, especially in the beginning, that weren't randomized or didn't have controls. And as I foreshadowed, it's really hard to have sham controls. Like, it's hard for people in a control group to give them fake Feldenkrais, fake functional integration, a fake awareness through movement, and like, there's a study from the osteopathy world of manipulative therapy for back pain, and about 75% of people could tell that they were getting the sham. So it's like, that is already reduces the external perception of the quality of your research, but it's just the nature of what we do that it's very hard to create shams.
But we could at least compare to some other intervention, correct? I mean,
absolutely, and many of the studies do in fact have a comparison to other interventions.
so it's not the same as a sham control, but it is at least looking at, it is at least a comparative.
Yeah, and some of our studies have shown similarities with Pilates or Qigong or whatever, and people are disappointed that it doesn't shine out stellarly in contrast to other things. But it's actually a good outcome if you get statistically significant improvement in comparison to another method. That's actually a good thing. My own view would be that studies that include Feldenkrais, another modality, and a treatment as usual group or a non-treatment group, I think they are even stronger. So, there's definitely ways we can improve them. But so far, we've got some good results, even in comparison to other modalities. And then some of our early studies, and these are the ones that show up in some of the early systematic reviews. If you go online and look for a review of Feldenkrais research, you might find something from 2005, 2006, and you'll see they have 5 or 6 papers in them. And some of them were the early studies, and some of them had Feldenkrais interventions that weren't really like what we do in practice. They had 1 half-hour taped awareness through movement lesson, for example. So they more of the studies now have people with more realistic amounts of involvement in awareness through movement and in functional integration. So we learned from those early studies. So the second myth is that somehow we need research to prove that it works for ourselves and our clients, and that's not true. That practitioners and clients experience that the method works. They get outcomes that the clients are looking for. People get less pain and greater function, and there's learning and development going on. So we don't need it that way for practitioners and our clients and students to know that they're getting benefit from the method. What's really useful, though, is we live in a society where, after profit, science is probably the second biggest paradigm. It's one of the biggest ideas in society. And being willing to engage in research shows a certain kind of openness to society to look at what we do and examine it. Because research really is, you take a phenomenon, you have something like Feldenkrais method or some aspect of Feldenkrais, and you look at it in a systematic way, and you're open about how you look at it, about your methods, and you're open about your results. What results did we get? And if you're not hiding your results and you're not, being unclear about your methods, that's all that really counts. That's really what research is. So engaging research shows to the world a certain kind of openness to reflect on what we do and what it achieves.
I was really impressed with Dr. Robert Schleip's presentation, where the research is showing that, how he practices as a Rolfer, as both a Rolfer and a Feldenkrais practitioner, but specifically he was talking about as a Rolfer, that what he was doing and how he was making the improvements was not what he thought he was doing, right? That the research really shows it's not about the manipulation of the fascia. It's about this fact that the fascia is this sensory organ. It's really talking to the nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a great example of that openness. He didn't say, it means my practice is nothing. and I should, you know, I didn't really do what I thought I did. He just said it didn't work the way that I thought it worked. And has a lot more to do with my voice and other aspects than the actual applying of pressure in the same way that I thought. So.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great example where that's an internal openness to the mechanisms of action, to how the method might work, from which we can learn a lot. And then there's openness to the world to say, this is what we've found about what works and what doesn't. Now, one of the great things in the research so far that's really important, is overlooked because it's kind of a null fact, is nobody's found that anybody has any injuries or any negative outcomes. All the research studies so far, no questions of safety at all. And that doesn't always apply to all the methods that people might use for the things they use Feldenkrais for. And then partly and increasingly, clients and certainly institutions like the medical world expect you to provide some information about effectiveness. So there's a whole paradigm in medicine of research-based practice, evidence-based practice, and it has some real limitations and is debated vigorously in the medical world. But people want to see that there's effectiveness. So going forward, we really do need to continue studies. And it's not like Feldenkrais method is a medical practice, but it produces therapeutic outcomes, right? It's a learning process that produces therapeutic outcomes. That's what we talk about in the standards of practice. So where there's those kind of therapeutic outcomes and where the world is looking for those, right? At the moment with the opioid crisis, people are looking for non-pharmacological ways to deal with pain, for example. So where we interact with that world, then we do need some research to help provide the case for why people should use Feldenkrais. Another objection I hear sometimes is that if we do research, it implies that Feldenkrais is a science and not an art. And it's clearly both, that there's a lot of artistry in any kind of complex human interaction and learning practice. And at the same time, Feldenkrais is based in scientific principles. Feldenkrais made use of the science that was available at the time when he developed the method. What's really important is that Feldenkrais isn't an applied science, that it's not taking scientific research and then turning that into protocols that are then applied lockstep to what we do. That there's a lot of creativity drawing on the science and drawing on the experience that we have as practitioners and students. So I mentioned there's research trials that have tested objective measures, changes of pressure on the feet, changes of pressure of the body lying down, which I'll talk a little bit about, changes in the organization of an activity in the brain and the nervous system, measures of movement at joints, for example. And then there's all kinds of self-report measures of things like quality of life, of ability to do things, all of that. So there's research trials that use them, and then equally important are qualitative and phenomenological studies that look at how people experience the method and what they learn. So we can benefit from research in terms of the outcomes that I was talking about and the mechanisms of action that we were talking about, Cynthia, that about finding out how Feldenkrais might work and finding commonalities with other approaches. Another kind of research is hypothesis and theory, where people take the research that we have so far, take our ideas, take ideas from other fields, and help us think about what Feldenkrais might be and how it might work, and help provide us language for what we do. And then a final area is practitioners reflecting on their practice, documenting what they do, and describing the ways they practice for the sake of other people. One level of research is expert knowledge, is expert opinion. And in a field like ours that really relies on the expertise of practitioners, that's also important. So these are basically the 4 categories of the types of papers that we publish in the Feldenkrais Research Journal. Good. So I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about some of the findings of research studies. So the area where we have the most high quality studies is in about balance and mobility for older adults. So these 4 studies here are all randomized controlled trials. Hillier and Worley found that they were good quality studies. Some of them used measures of mobility and balance, like the time to get up and go, where somebody gets up from a seat and starts to move through the world. And the quicker you can do that, the more easily you can do that. It's a measure of how you're going with your movement. Some use a functional reach measure to measure balance. Others involved balance confidence, which is kind of at the interface between what you can do and how you feel about how you can do it. So we've got a bit of a body of evidence there that Feldenkrais helps with balance and mobility with older adults. And then Stevens and his colleagues also did a good quality study for people with MS with the same topic, balance and mobility. And then Bitter, Hillier, and Civetta did a marvelous study using just one awareness through movement lesson and showing people had a greater dexterity. They were able to put the pegs in the pegboard. It's the Purdue pegboard test, and with greater facility, and also grasp the moving objects of different weights with more appropriate levels of effort. It's a great important ability to be able to grasp something with just the right amount of effort based on its weight, its movement, its texture. So they saw improvements in that in their study, and also people reported that they felt like they were using less effort in their hands and that handwriting was easier, for example, after doing just the one lesson. The other studies, they involved awareness through movement lessons, 10, 20 or so awareness through movement lessons. There's a nice study done by Lama back in 2000 colleagues in 2004 with young women with eating disorders. And they used like 7 different measures of how people perceive their body, how they feel about their body, how they feel about themselves. And the young women involved, after doing the awareness through movement lessons, found things that they were more content with the parts of the body that they found problematic. They had more acceptance of their body and greater familiarity with it. These are all from the tests, from the measures that we use. They felt more spontaneous and self-confident in their behavior and less helpless. So I think, if we think about Feldenkrais's ideas that we engage with self-image, then here's some, good quality randomized controlled trial using multiple measures that showed some nice outcomes in that area.
Well, and for an issue that there is often not a lot available to really help people with eating disorders effectively. So that to me seems really significant, where we can probably find quite a few things to work with balance, which I love our studies. I'm not saying that, but
yeah,
I've worked with people with eating disorders, and it's a challenge for them to find other ways to engage with themselves, to really enjoy their bodies, or at least find some acceptance of it.
Right. And I think, one of my thoughts from my own research and one of the findings from my own research is built into Feldenkrais are all these things that, you see, for example, in mindfulness, about taking a non-judgmental attitude to the body and be focused on just the facts of how your body makes contact with the floor. I think practicing those things that are forms of self-acceptance and self-care built into the lessons is like values in action in a Feldenkrais lesson. And I think then you can see a study like this shows that it had an impact for these young women. The couple of studies about neck and shoulder pain, factory workers in Sweden had decreases in complaints of neck and shoulder pain, and they had less disability in their recreational activities. There was a no intervention control that got worse and a physical therapy group that had no change, for example. That's the Lundblad study from '99. And then a recent study from Lundqvist and colleagues looking at neck and scapular pain for people with visual impairments. And the authors, this study used functional integration and awareness through movement. And the authors thought that the touch part of functional integration was probably an important part of it for people with visual impairments, that touches some of the language for people with visual impairments, important part of how they experience themselves. And they thought Feldenkrais, the touch part of Feldenkrais, played a role in this study. There's been a really good study recently from Paolucci, I hope I'm saying it right, and colleagues about back pain, comparing Feldenkrais with a regular back score, which has, psychophysical education about back pain and then regular kind of exercises. And Feldenkrais helped reduce the pain intensity more quickly and shift the pain perception faster. And it was a nicely designed study. And now we're starting to get studies like this one that have a follow-up. So 3 months later, there was done a follow-up and people maintained their improvements. So this is a bit of a model of the directions that some of our studies can go in terms of quality. Now, in contrast, Connors, Pyle, and Nichols was an important study. It wasn't randomized or controlled or blinded, but what was interesting was that 11 practitioners across Australia were involved, and they saw about 48 clients. I think they had full data on about 33. And in terms of pain, they had significant pain reduction. So it's important that we have studies of functional integration, not just awareness through movement. And I think it was a really nice model of a group of practitioners collecting data in their practices. So I hope there's more studies like that in the future. Connors, Pyle, and Nichols, and also Hillier and colleagues in their randomized controlled trial with older adults used a really interesting measure. They used a patient-specific functional scale. So rather than us doing a study of Feldenkrais and climbing stairs, Feldenkrais and squatting, which we could do, Feldenkrais and carrying, what they did was they got people to nominate a particular functional activity that they want to improve through the functional integration or through the awareness through movement, and then found out at the end whether people perceived that their abilities had improved through the course of the study. And that might include gentle activities like lying and sitting and standing, climbing stairs, through to much more vigorous things, housework, exercise, dancing, all those kind of things. And people got statistically significant outcomes on those scales. So this is one way we could move forward, is given that Feldenkrais is very functionally oriented, people come to us with problems of what they can't do and would like to do. This is one way that we can build that functional idea into our research and individualize it for the people who come. And then there's also some studies of quality of life and mood. Texiera Machado and colleagues did a nice study using the Parkinson's quality of life questionnaire and found significant results. And then again, Hillier and co. and Connors and co. found big improvements in quality of life, or significant improvements in quality of life in their studies. And the quality of life measures, they have panels of things like, can I carry out my emotional functions? Does pain get in the way of me carrying out my practical everyday functions? Can I do my job? Can I sleep? Looking at all those aspects of life. And there were results in many of those areas of those quality of life measures for the Feldenkrais studies that were done. And then Ullman and Williams did a controlled study, not a randomized controlled study, but a controlled study that found a reduction in depression with older adults from doing Feldenkrais awareness through movement. So jumping now to mechanisms of action. So we have some nice studies that are starting to show, using objective measures, how Feldenkrais can make changes in the body and be measured. So this is a beautiful study by Jules Verel and colleagues, including Elad Almagor and Frank Schurman. They put people in a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, which measures the blood flow to parts of the brain. And the blood flow indicates activity in parts of the brain. So then the practitioner, who is Elad Almagor, worked on the person doing the artificial floor lesson that we use in functional integration, where you bring a board to somebody's foot and manipulate from the foot or with the foot. And so she had two intentions. So one was a local condition where she was really thinking of just manipulating the foot and the ankle and the toes and seeing what changes and what differentiation and integration could be achieved there. And then she was thinking of working through the foot and the ankle into the whole body, pushing through the skeleton, pushing through the whole body toward the head, which is another way that we use that practice in functional integration. And when they looked at the changes with the fMRI, they saw that the resting state regional homogeneity, or ROHO, which is a measure of changes in the connectivity in the brain. And they found that that changed. And not only did it change, but it changed in a way that reflected what the intention was. So where the manipulation was focused more on the ankle and the foot, right, there was a smaller parts of the somatosensory cortices that are involved with bodily perception, smaller amount that changed in terms of regional homogeneity. And where the intention was more global and pushing and working through the whole body from the foot and the ankle, then there was more of the brain that was changed, activity in the brain that was changed in the functional integration lesson. So this is one of the first times that we've really had this level of objective measures of neurological change.
Yeah, it's an exciting one to me.
Yeah, and very ingenious, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because, you know, one of the things is the world's become very enamored with functional MRI and EEG, electroencephalogram, where you measure brain activity. And particularly like autonomic functions, relaxation or cognition, those kinds of things. But the problem with those things is you can't have any movement while you're doing them, right? So here there's minimal movement while the person was in the MRI machine, and then they were measuring after the manipulation happened. And it's actually a sign of how important movement is to the brain, that if you move, lots of the brain are involved, even with the electroencephalogram, you know, where they have the electrodes all over the head. The whole brain lights up with movement, and they can't differentiate subtle differences in cognition and emotion and whatever. And in a way, that's a limitation to our research, but it also shows how important movement is to the nervous system and therefore to our sense of ourselves. So, and then there was the other thing is that some of the research that Feldenkrais methods, science that Feldenkrais methods based on, is old research from the 30s and the 50s of the last century, involving the firing of muscles and how the nervous system organizes muscular contraction. And there was an idea mid-last century of dyskinesis, of dys meaning bad, and kinesis means muscular effort or work, right? And we're very familiar with this. It's built into the Feldenkrais method that part of what we do is change muscular tonus, which allows changes in resting and changes in how we move. So we have a couple of studies that work with that idea. So one was Stevens and colleagues, where they measured people's knee extension from doing a number of lessons, which people took home, recordings, and did lessons as home practice. So that was interesting that they got the lengthening and measured at the knee extension, and the hamstrings cross several joints, so it's not necessarily just in one joint, but they measured it there. But the other interesting finding is that the people who did the lessons were, athletes and people who were familiar with stretching. And when they interviewed them, they didn't experience the Feldenkrais of stretching. So they got these improvements on the one hand. On the other hand, they felt like they weren't doing stretching. They were doing something different. So that's significant in terms of us thinking about changing the muscular organization rather than stretching per se. And then a recent ingenious study by Brummer, I'm not sure, they did functional integration with people on a table that measured the pressure. And as practitioners, we know, and our clients know, often the pattern of how they contact the table, how much of them contacts the table, the floor changes. This is the first time that we have research proof of it. And again, more evidence that we do create those changes in the muscular organization. And then briefly, Connors and co did a nice textual analysis of a Feldenkrais balance program and got other people who were experts on motor learning and postural control retraining to look at it and analyze it, and saw that our teaching strategies were really consistent with what's known about that field of motor learning and postural control training. And the texts that they looked at were from one of the programs, one of the randomized controlled trials. So this is a kind of double level of research here. It's a program that got the outcomes and is consistent with the theories of how people learn to move differently. So Feldenkrais is a method of experiential learning. And so what clients experience and students experience is important. It's not trivial, right? Feldenkrais himself said we act on the basis of our perceptions. So this is where qualitative and phenomenological studies really come in. So there's been about 3 really good qualitative studies, and I should add a caveat that I'm really talking about the studies in English here. There's other good studies in German and Italian stuff that I haven't been translated, and so I don't have access to. But Broom and her colleagues interviewed older adults about doing awareness through movement. They talked about reduced pain, that they were gentle physical and cognitive exercises. They got the mental part of Feldenkrais as well, and it improved their activities in daily living, and they felt more mindful. This is a nice study by Ullman and colleagues in Sweden, using grounded theory and participant journals. And it was an intervention where they did a number of awareness through movement lessons over a period of time. And people had reduced pain and postural changes. They felt more erect without effort, more space to breathe, those kind of physiological things, but also the psychophysical things of feeling more self-confidence, of more hope and security, and a sense of more space for themselves. And one theme that occurs across all the qualitative studies, being less willing to sacrifice themselves to do things, to not push themselves going into pain or strain, learning how to move and listen to the bodies in ways, as I can see you're doing now, Cynthia, listening to their body's needs. And I hope people in the audience are moving too. I'm moving. Not willing to sacrifice themselves and get into pain, because of social goals and social pressures. So that's a lovely study, really worth reading. And then Pugh and Williams worked with, did phenomenological interviews with people who had back pain from anywhere from 2 to 27 years. And they did a series of functional integration or awareness through movement lessons with a practitioner. And the same kind of thing. People felt like they got tools, they got increased awareness, they changed their relationship with their body, they felt more confident with their body. They had choices about how to move and could think before they moved, not to trigger pain, and were more fully able to be in their lives. And again, resistance to the culture that says you have to work 14 hours a day, and more less willingness to get themselves into situations where they had more pain. This was very consistent with my own dissertation study. Lots of reports of increased calmness, and especially about this ability to change your own bodily experience, to go from being in pain to having less pain, from going from discomfort to having more comfort, going from feeling ill at ease and alienated and out of touch from your body to being in touch with your body, as well as things like less pain and all of that. And I came to the conclusion, the analysis, that Feldenkrais for them was an experience of self-caring, right? That really for them it was about self-care. They came with all that pain and dysfunction. Then they experienced improvement, like ease, like less pain. So it's just a kind of almost a step-like thing. They came hoping, they experienced that improvement, and that led them to feel really good and having, feeling much better about themselves and in their lives. And so then they worked out how to take care of themselves. If you're thinking about self-care, how to go slowly, how to use less effort, how to use the imagination when you can't actually make a movement without increasing the pain. And that led to a really important thing that relates to the other studies, which was a sense of I can. Rather than going from a sense of I can't do things without pain, I can't do anything about the pain, to a sense of I can. And phenomenologically, it's a really fundamental concept and a fundamental thing for human beings to feel that sense of empowerment.
This,
and then, yes.
This pretty much sums up what people really want when they come to Feldenkrais. This is the kinds of things they're looking for.
Yeah. So I was pretty delighted that came through so strongly in the research. And then they keep doing it. They know that they move differently. If they've got to do something that's going to be challenging, they'll get down on the floor and do some awareness through movement. If they get in some pain, they'll get down on the floor and do some awareness through movement. They'll keep going to classes. They'll bring some movement challenge or problem to their practitioner. So the final part is doing it. They just integrated Feldenkrais into their lives. These were long-term students of the method. And I wanted to study that because I wanted to see, really the impact it made on people's lives. So there's a lot, I'm not going to mention any specific studies, but there's a lot of research in the arts and creative practice. And I'm going to provide a list of the studies I mentioned here. And in the list, for people who are interested, I'll include some of the best art studies. This is really a whole burgeoning area. In the next edition of the Feldenkrais Research Journal, which will be out in a couple of weeks in mid-May, we'll have 10, 12 really good articles on arts and creative practice in Feldenkrais. And a lot of it is research into how students, like in universities studying dance, studying acting, how they respond to the introduction of a somatic practice like Feldenkrais, which is a little different than the performance orientation. And then a lot of it is Feldenkrais teachers who've taken Feldenkrais into art settings and reflecting on their practice and how to do it. So that'll be rich for people who want to work in the arts. And this is really a whole burgeoning area of our practice and research. So here's some resources. And again, I'll include these on the list if people want to get the list. There's the IFF has a reference database that has lots and lots and lots of articles, hundreds of articles on the Feldenkrais method. So you can look in there and see if there's something on a topic that interests you. But in addition, there's a couple of curated databases within there. So one is the list of the high quality trials that Hillier and Worley looked at in their systematic review. So you could just look at that list. There's also another curated list of the qualitative studies that I mentioned. So you can go in there and play around with that database and see if there's something there that interests you. So there's research studies and other kinds of writing about Feldenkrais. And then we have the research journal. There's been 5 volumes so far, and 6, as I said, on the arts is coming out soon.
Are these links open to anyone?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's really important for the public to have access to these things, and other professions to have access to these things. That's how knowledge improves and expands. And And then in terms of me, first, thank yous. So, the work that Hillier and Worley and Buchanan did on doing their reviews are both really important. And one of your speakers on this track, Diane, helped me in reviewing some of the more recent literature. She has a great deal of expertise. And then everybody who's done research so far really deserves thanks. Whether I mention it here or not, it's a lot of work to do research, and it really is a commitment. And it's like, not every research study is a star, is the best study ever, but you're developing a research culture. And I think we're starting to develop a research culture in the Feldenkrais world. And then this is me. That's my website. Oops, there's a spelling error there. feldenkraissf.com. I'll correct that when Cynthia.
Arlene is putting the links into the chat,
yeah.
And we'll make sure you have the right links on the Feldenkrais Summit page and in the handout. Yeah.
Thank you. I type Feldenkrais so often that my fingers get tangled sometimes. I need some hand lessons. And then I provide an audio of an awareness through movement lesson, so people can do one and see that I actually can teach Feldenkrais as well as talk about research. And then, as I said, there's a list of references from this talk. And I could also share the slides too, if that was useful.
I would think people would like that, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So that's kind of what I have to say.
Good.
Yeah.
Just stop the share and then we'll chat
okay, sure. Let's chat some.
Thank you. Thank you. Very important. Actually, I try to keep somewhat up to date on the research, but I have to say that's more impressive than I realized. So, and I know we still have a long ways to go. I'm not saying that we have gigantic volumes, but there's some really nice studies in there, especially in the more recent ones I maybe haven't been reading up as much on.
Yeah.
I had an interesting conversation when Carol Montgomery and I were first fantasizing about studying Bones for Life 15 years ago. We were looking at grants from CAM and applying through their process. And I actually called because they give you a notebook that's this thick to start to work through. And I thought, I'm going to just kind of have a conversation with somebody to find out how likely it is that we're going to be on this list, because that could take a year for us just to fill out that item. And one of the interesting things that came out of the conversation is she said, I don't know why you think you're alternative medicine. She was a researcher with CAM. She was a researcher with CAM. And she said, I don't know why you think you're alternative medicine. I said, well, really, I don't. But that's where everybody puts us. So
right. Yeah.
It was kind of a little moment for me.
It's really hard, I think, where you have something that has outcomes that are therapeutic, but it's a learning process. I think it's hard for people to know where to put us. People come to us for things that they might also go to a doctor for, to movement dysfunction or pain or a coach or a psychotherapist for depression, or something about the sense of themselves and feeling disembodied and all of that. So I think there's ways in which so-called medicine is coming closer to understanding that learning processes are important. There's always been some learning things in medicine, like diabetes education. You couldn't keep people alive with diabetes if you didn't do educational processes. And increasingly for all the chronic conditions, people are realizing the educational component, helping people identify their intentions and identify, why they want to make changes. It's essential. So I think there's ways in which we definitely don't fit within CAM, and yet because we produce outcomes in that world in some ways, I think, increasingly wants to interact with us. But as I said, we can also be very much people who people come to for whatever they want in their life. So it's really...
I think that's where it gets nebulous, is because there's so many things that people would seek us out for. Although, I don't know exactly why we get hung up on that, because people have all kinds of shifts in their life as a result of a successful surgery.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting that we, as a culture, we get really hung up on why can't we put you in a box?
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah, and I think, I mean, and what we know now too about the relationship, right? Healing occurs in relationships. So whether it's your primary care or your surgeon, people are going to do better if they have a relationship, and we have that very special relationship. This is definitely something we could study, is how we manifest that relationship when we really listen to people. We take people's experience seriously. We're kind of all phenomenologists. We like, what do you experience about yourself, about your body, about your movement, about your breathing? So we take people's experience seriously, and they hear that. And then when we touch them, we're using a listening touch that's not corrective and not, you should do this, and so people feel profoundly listened to. So healing or change or transformation always occurs in relationship, and Feldenkrais has that potential.
mm-hmm. You mentioned that it's a lot of work, so I can attest to that. That when you're not in it's a lot of work even when you're in a research-based setting, or where there's support. It's a tremendous amount of work there. But as somebody who did publish in the last 2 years ago, that took us really several years, because you're out in your own practice. You don't have any connections to the research world. You're learning as you go. You have to keep a full-time practice going, and you're kind of doing all parts of everything. And and of course that also means it limits the quality to some degree of what you're going to get, for sure, because you don't have the funding to do a lot of the extra things that you might like to do. But it's at the same time, there are some small kinds of studies, like, I taught a series on squatting just a few weeks ago, and in one night, I saw people squat improve by such a large amount, with one man who had been really struggling from surgery for a year now, that I thought, oh my gosh, what a simple study, right? Just one lesson, a squat, could it. And you could compare that to some other, who else can spend an hour and make that kind of improvement.
Right.
I mean, maybe it would turn out that I just had a group of people that could improve really easily if you really did a randomized control study. Maybe it wouldn't show what I think it would, but it's interesting to entertain.
Yeah, and that's an example of something that could be done then across a number of practitioners, and maybe find some way to have a control, but it does take a lot of time. One thing that there's a research committee of the International Feldenkrais Federation as well. And one thing we're doing to try and see if we can build that culture, but also help facilitate research, is identify who in the community has advanced degrees, who's done research, even if they're not doing it now, may be able to provide knowledge and expertise and encouragement for people doing research. So I think if we get a more networked community, that's helpful. And then also thinking about what kind of studies could be done. And some may need to be those very high-level randomized controlled trials. Like years ago, the Alexander teachers did one on back pain in the United Kingdom that led to the National Health Service prescribing Alexander technique. And then there was pushback from the medical establishment. But we may need studies like that, but also the study done by Connors and Pyle and Nichols in Australia, just using practitioners around the country and just using a small number of measures, of pain, of function, of quality of life. There's probably ways of doing quite elegant things. The pressure plate thing, using the whole table, or even pressure plate under the feet, like they use for the MS study on balance. That's, it's all, some of the technologies are not so far away, and there's some new ones that can magnify movement visually, for example. Somebody in the Baltimore Feldenkrais training was showing that technology to us. So for changes in the autonomic nervous system. We might be able to use heart rate variability with wireless heart rate variability monitors. So some of the technology may also make it easier to
It's more accessible. I mean,
accessible.
one of the challenges that we ran into with our study was just the quality of how you administer the test, and that simple thing turned out not to be simple.
Right.
And took quite a long time to train and be consistent in how we administered the tests.
Right.
So, things sound simple, but then even a paper and pencil test has a way it has to be administered.
That's right.
And that's something that the Feldenkrais world can sometimes be we can be a little not wanting to conform quite that much. We like to be able to do our own thing, but when we research, things have to be very boom, 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 boom.
Right. Yeah, they have to be very systematic and really finding ways to avoid bias on the one hand, be inclusive of all kinds of people on the other. So yeah, getting those details right is very important, but then it adds to the validity of what you've done.
Right. Well, one thing you mentioned, Cliff, was that you have provided in the bonus materials, if you happen to upgrade while the summit is still happening, which means not very much longer, we're on day 9, I think it's 9. You can get all the access to all the recordings for $25 discount, with a $25 discount off of it. That ends when the summit is over. And Cliff has put a beautiful lesson in there on lengthening the back and arms. Very lovely audio lesson.
One of the primary image lessons using the lines and the points in the body. I love those lessons.
That's a gift. So, I mean, those lessons are a gift. So thank you for doing that. It'll be a really unique lesson. And you can learn more about Cliff and his practice at Feldenkrais SF. So there's 2 S's there together, Feldenkrais SF for San Francisco.com. And Cliff, we are asking speakers to tell us, since the theme is the map is the territory, how would you like to expand your own personal map or the map of our work? Maybe you feel like you've answered that, but I'll just give you a chance to think about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'd like to, continue on with doing the qualitative research, the phenomenological research, and looking into some of the nature of some of these things that are built into this complex method, like people being absorbed into their own experience, or like there's a whole lot of phenomena that people talked about imagining into the body, that in an ATM lesson where they didn't know how to make the next movement, and they took the clues and saw and felt into their body at the same time, maybe saw their skeleton or had a sense of space. I think some of those phenomena that have probably been not even documented in any method, and there's methods of microphenomenology, of looking at little pieces of experience, but I suspect that they are going to be rich for Feldenkrais method, and then they may have other applications for yoga and hypnosis and other things. So I think I love exploring experience and then starting to map that and see how it connects with the rest of the Feldenkrais method and with other ways of enhancing human life.
Oh, thank you. That sounds.
Nice.
I'd love to see more of that. I think that would be a very rich area, and it feels very Feldenkrais, where sometimes we don't like to think of Feldenkrais as being able to be put into these nice little tables and charts. You have a connection with the human experience and those types of studies that are written.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And that went fast, and we could do many more discussions. We could do a whole hour just on phenomenology, right? But we got a good start with Diane, another iteration with you on the actual research with Feldenkrais. And in the next session in this track, Todd Hargrove is going to talk about pain science and Feldenkrais. And it's going to be a very conversational interview. So we're just going to go back and forth because Todd didn't want to do this PowerPoint type presentation. So for those of you who are saying, "Oh my gosh, like I've had enough of the PowerPoint," it's going to be Todd and I talking.
Right.
And I'm looking forward to that. And then, of course, that's at noon. And then following that will be the panel discussion with Anastasi Siotis and Stefan Igelid. And we'll dig into this all a little bit more.
Great. It's very exciting.
And you're welcome to join us in the chat section, Cliff. I don't know if you'll be able to do that or not, but that chat, we're inviting presenters to come back and join the chat. And if people want to direct questions at you, they can, and you can chime into the chat, and who knows where we might go with that. But
great.
Let us know if you're out there.
Okay, well, I'll if I'll check my schedule, but yeah, if I'm there, I'll let people know I'm there.
Yeah, great.
All right.
So thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you back in about 3 hours, a little less maybe. Okay.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Cynthia. Bye, everybody.